really excited for today's talk with Lee Taylor Johnson. If you are here, feel free to say hello in the chat. I always love seeing everybody's names. So many familiar names by this point, actually, and where you are in the world. I'm in Toronto. So hello, everybody. We're just going to wait just a minute or two so that everybody who's going to be watching live today has a chance to show up before we get started. So hello, everybody. Um, welcome in Berlin and the Poconos and Iowa and Pennsylvania and Palo Alto. Oh, and South Wales. Hello in Oregon. A lot of Oregon people. I grew up in Oregon, Portland. Hello in Ohio and the UK and Mexico and Jersey Shore. Hello in Croatia. A wonderful place to visit, I hear. Hello in Spain. Hello, everybody. So we're just going to wait one more minute before we get started so everybody has a chance to show up. I'm going to pull up my notes and make sure I'm ready on my end. Really excited for today's talk. I think it's going to be a lot of fun and really helpful to a lot of writers. So yeah, hello everybody. Welcome and thank you for being here. All right, let's get started. Hello, writers. This is Jacob Jans with the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Lee Taylor Johnson, who will be giving a talk on writing a satisfying final act to your novel or story. This is part of our monthly lecture series where we host talks on the business of writing and the business of publishing and the craft of writing. Lee is a regular contributor to Authors Publish and has written 3 books for us, including How to Write a Dynamic Act 1, How to Write a Compelling Act 2, and I'm also pleased to announce that we're just about to release their 3rd book in this series, How to Write a Satisfying Act 3 for your novel. Very excited about publishing that very soon. So in addition to writing for Authors Publish, Lee is also a fiction editor and a writing coach specializing in developmental editing for science fiction, fantasy, romance, and horror. She is also a founder of the Editorial Freelancer Association LGBTQ plus chapter. I'm really excited to learn from Lee today. I know they've put a lot of work into this presentation. So thank you for being here, Lee. Welcome. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I am very,
Yeah,
very excited to be here.
yeah, I think that this is going to be really great. So I'm looking forward to learning about the essential scenes to close a story and to make readers really happy.
Yeah, the ever tough, very foreboding ending of even the happiest books.
Yeah. Well, if you are ready, please go ahead and pull up your slideshow and get started. While you're doing that, everybody should know that at the end of the talk, there will be a discussion and we will be taking questions from the audience. So at that point, you can put your questions in the Q&A box and we'll take your questions after that. So thank you.
Yeah, let me just make sure that this is set up here. There we go. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Like Jacob said, my name is Lee, and we are going to be talking about writing the essential scenes of Act 3, specifically on how to use them to write a satisfying conclusion to your novel. Um, I will give everybody a tiny bit of a warning in advance. I've got a little bit of a throat tickle, so if I clear my throat a lot, I am sorry. I also tend to talk a little bit quickly. I am trying my best to slow it down, but feel free to just say in the chat if you need me to chill a little bit, and I will. Um, but yeah, other than that, let's go ahead and get started. Let's see if I have this here. All right, so we are going to cover a few main points. Firstly, what are the essential scenes? We're going to talk about what makes a scene essential to your story, as well as what the essential scenes of Act 3 actually are. We'll be going over how the scenes fit into the structure of your third act using the climax of one of my favorite movies as an example. We'll then talk about what makes them work. So we'll get into the nitty-gritty of like the purpose of these scenes, covering what each essential scene is meant to do for the story, as well as the elements and details that allow it to actually do that. Um, and then finally, and most importantly, we'll talk about what you need to do in order to pull these scenes off. This is kind of similar to our previous question, but a bit more focused on tips and tricks that will help you during the writing process so that you can best deliver the best possible version of these scenes to the readers. We've got a couple of guiding questions that you can use as prompts as you write, so you can double check that your scenes contain all of the information they need in order to be effective. So starting out, what is an essential scene? Basically, these are key beats that define your story's overall plot. These scenes create the rough shape of your story you're telling, both in terms of the major features of your genre and the specifics that make the story unique to you and your idea. These scenes are considered essential because they uphold the narrative structure of your story. They make sure that all of your big moments happen, but also that they happen at the right time and carry the right amount of importance. If you have attended any of my previous talks, this graphic might look familiar. Um, this is a representation of the three-act structure, starting with the opening scenes in Act 1 and ending with the closing scenes or resolution in Act 3. The green line is the path that your story follows throughout the acts, with the tension and stakes rising and falling over time. And as you can see from the little stars on here, most of the essential scenes take place at the peaks and troughs of this line, where the stakes and tension are at their highest or their lowest. And there are also, it's very light on this graphic, but if you can see the little yellow dotted lines on there, there's also essential scenes located on the dividers that help transition between the acts. So as you can see, we can assume there will be at least three essential scenes, one at the transition between acts 2 and 3, one at the climax, and another one at the resolution. This is more or less true, but it's important to note that this graphic just shows the absolute basics of the three-act structure and doesn't take into account anything like character arcs or subplots or anything like that. For our purposes, we're actually considering the road to the climax, so the little strip between the first and second arrow, to be its own essential scene, sort of an essential sequence, meaning that we actually end up with a total of 4 essential scenes for Act 3. But in general, this is still a pretty helpful guide to keep in mind while drafting. Um, so we will break down each of these scenes shortly, but we're going to start by seeing them in action. Back to the Future is one of my favorite movies of all time, but I think it works as an especially good example because it uses the scenes in Act 3 to such excellent effect. In my experience and everyone that I've talked to, no matter how many times you have seen this movie, there's still a little bit of the climax that kind of keeps you on the edge of your seat. To wondering if Marty will end up making it in time, which is exactly the kind of investment you want readers to have in your story. Um, so we'll just do a quick walkthrough of the climax and the essential scenes and take a look at how they correspond to the diagram that we looked at in the previous slide to hopefully give you a better idea of the shape that your third act can take. And while we're going through them, I invite you to just think about how each of these scenes build on each other in order to create tension, as well as what they contribute to the end of the movie as a whole. There's not going to be a quiz, so don't like worry about it too much. But it can kind of help to be thinking about this in advance before we get into what actually makes it happen. So Act 3 begins shortly after the Enchantment Under the Sea dance. Marty has successfully gotten his parents together. His home in the future is secured, and he even got a crowd to listen to and appreciate his guitar playing. At this point in the story, Marty has realized that he needs to take conscious action if he wants the future to go his way. He can't just sit by and hope that things will work out for him. I see in the chat someone, Sue Morris, says she's never seen this film. I highly recommend it if you haven't yet, and I apologize for the spoilers that you're going to be getting. But moving forward with this new mentality, Marty sits down to write a letter to his friend Doc Brown, warning him of his upcoming death in 1985, where Marty is from. Doc has so far been pretty resistant to learning any information that might affect the future, so Marty writes him not to open the letter until 1985, then goes to meet him in front of the clock tower where they run through their plan one more time. Marty will drive the time machine to a set location down the street, affix a metal hook to the back of the DeLorean time machine, and shortly before 10:04 p.m., he'll drive toward the tower where he'll reach the requisite 88 miles per hour just as lightning strikes the clock tower, powering the flux capacitor and sending him back to the future where he belongs. They sync their watches, and things pretty much immediately start to go wrong. Doc finds the letter that Marty slipped into his pocket, and furious at his continued attempts to change the future, rips it into pieces. Marty is devastated, but goes to the appointed spot on the road and installs the lightning hook. But the wind then blows a branch into their setup and disconnects the wire that's supposed to channel the electricity from a lightning strike into the flux capacitor. Things kind of continue to spiral from there. The DeLorean doesn't start. Doc reconnects the wire at ground level only to have it unplug again up at the top of the clock tower. Marty gets a late start on his drive. Doc loses his footing while he's trying to climb the clock tower. And as their time of 10:04 p.m. draws near, it seems like Marty might not make it back in time and will end up stuck in 1955. So, unbeknownst to Doc, Marty has one last trick up his sleeve to try to save his life. So now he is determined to save the future in order to save his friend, uh, change the future to save his friend, sorry. And he sets the time machine back a few minutes before he first traveled into the past, which gives him a small window in which to warn Doc about the shooting. Doc gets the wire reconnected just as the lightning strikes, successfully sending Marty back to 1985. Marty speeds into the future and the DeLorean powers down, forcing him to rush on foot to the Lone Pine Mall, where he first used the time machine. He arrives just a moment too late, however, and watches in horror as his friend is gunned down and his past self rockets into 1955. The shooters leave, and Marty races down to Doc's body in tears. But Doc suddenly wakes up from his shock and reveals to Marty that his life was saved by the bulletproof vest he was wearing under his lab coat. Marty asks how he knew to take precautions, and Doc pulls Marty's 30-year-old taped together letter from his pocket. Well, I figured, he says, what the hell? Marty returns home to find his life restored, though with some notable changes. His family's home is nicer, his sister is popular, his brother is successful, and his parents are much happier. George is a best-selling author, and Lorraine is sober, and Biff's presence in their life is not as a bully, but as a simpering crony. Marty discovers that his parents have bought him the truck that he dreamed about as a surprise for his weekend away with his girlfriend Jennifer, whom they had previously disapproved of. Marty ends up with a happy life, having learned that taking an active role in the present results in a better future. So here is a look at how all of those scenes fit into the structure of Act 3. See how they kind of work together to build tension and heighten the stakes as we head into the climax. As you can kind of see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we steadily have tension growing as things start to go wrong, all the way to the point that Marty successfully makes it back to the future and saves his friend. And the lesson that he ends up learning as a result of this is that his friend's life is important enough to take risks for. He experiences a literal race against the clock as he attempts to return home, and he makes it just in time to discover that his actions had meaning before the story comes to a close. So, with all of this in mind, let's break down our essential scenes and see how you can make them work for your story. We are starting with the plan, which happens pretty much immediately after the Act 2 transition. Both of these scenes are about shifting the story's focus back to the external plot, and because of this, it can be kind of tempting to blend them together for the sake of avoiding repetition. But there's actually a distinct difference to the overall purpose that keeps them separate. If you had attended my lecture previously, you might know, but the Act 2 transition is about preparing for Act 3 in general, and the plan is specifically about preparing for the climax. So, like the name suggests, the plan is where your characters formulate their plan of attack for whatever upcoming confrontation is happening. You can kind of picture the scene in pretty much any heist movie where all of the characters are sitting around a table, like discussing how things are going to go down. And the goal here is to give everyone a clear task moving forward and to set reader expectations accordingly. Part of this is reminding readers what is at stake for the protagonist and the story as a whole. This is the closest the characters have ever been to achieving their goal. So this scene works to ensure that your audience has a clear picture of what challenges are on the way and what the characters stand to lose if they fail. Reiterating the stakes has the added benefit of increasing the tension, which is important partly because we're approaching the point in that structure diagram where the stakes and tensions sharply increase, and we want to make that feel as natural as possible. And partly because we're coming off the end of Act Two, which is ideally just wrapped up some things related to the character arc and leaves us in a period of pretty low tension. Overall, the goal of the essential scene is to shift the story's focus back to the external conflict and the stakes at hand, introducing readers to the accelerated pace and urgent tone that characterizes Act 3. To accomplish this, there are three major things you'll need to do, starting with outlining what's at risk. This kind of comes with the territory of Act 3. It's because it's the closest the characters have come to achieving their goal. It's also the closest they've come to facing their biggest challenge. These stakes are literally staring them in the face. So part of writing this scene will be just acknowledging what those stakes are. So for the sake of actually giving you some advice here, I recommend focusing specifically on what's at stake for the protagonist, what they personally stand to lose or gain, what they believe their chances are, and how they generally feel about it all. Next up is providing a source of clear tension right away. Again, some of this will happen naturally as the scene progresses and the characters get closer to the challenge, but you can also help it along the way by adding in small plot twists and complications to keep things from going too smoothly. And finally, strike a balance between your tension and drama. The details that you include in this scene control the expectations that readers have about Act 3. So the more they know going in, the higher the tension will be as they wait for things to inevitably go wrong. The more they're in the dark, the greater the shock and surprise when an unforeseen twist happens. There's no one size fits all perfect balance, but you can find your ideal mix by keeping in mind which direction you're leaning from the beginning. So, since we're focused on the external conflict for the next few scenes, our guiding questions are largely focused on addressing outside factors. Answering these questions will go a long way toward everything we've discussed so far in regards to increasing tension. Firstly, what is the major conflict awaiting your protagonist? In other words, the big bad at the end of the story, the grand gesture that needs to be made, or the confrontation they've been sort of dreading. What remaining obstacles stand between them in this conflict? There are little things that they have to account for when putting their plan together, and the twists that will help you with the whole balancing tension and drama thing. How are they prepared to face these obstacles? You can approach this either physically or emotionally, depending on the nature of your story. I do recommend including at least a little bit of the physical, especially if the big moment involves some kind of prop or MacGuffin that needs foreshadowing. And then who and what do they rely on for support? Do they have a team, a group of friends, a backup squad with beloved characters that we'd be really upset to see killed off? That's will add some tension as well. So looking at our Back to the Future example, the major conflict awaiting Marty is twofold. He might end up stuck in the past if the plan doesn't work, and even if he does make it back, there's still a chance that Doc will die before he can save him. The obstacles are the same as they've been throughout the entire movie. He needs a way to get back to the future. For now, his plan of action is to trust that Doc's weather experiment will work and that the letter he's writing will be adequate to warn him of the shooting. And as far as who he relies on for support, it's his good friend, Doc Brown. So moving forward, our next essential scene is contact with the enemy, which is all about putting the carefully constructed plan from the last scene through the ringer. This is the point where the climax really begins, and as the point where things start to go wrong, will steadily escalate into your final plot twist, which is the kind of make or break moment for your protagonist. Deanna, thank you for the call out. I will try to slow down. I'm sorry. So the main purpose of this scene is to be kicking off the climax. This starts with the initial complications that get in the way of the protagonist's plan, with each complication feeding into the next and growing in scale until the final challenge appears. These complications work to continue raising the stakes and increasing the tension, all in service of once again making sure that the faster pace of Act 3 still feels natural and still feels earned. And ultimately, what we're doing with all of this is kind of setting up the twist that defines the climax. You want your climax to have meat to it, which means treating it as a serious threat that's come about through a combination of outside forces and actions that the characters have taken throughout the story. Um, these this last essential sequence that takes the place across the plan and contact with the enemy lets you get those last couple of ducks in a row to make sure that the climax really packs the punch that you're aiming for. So the primary goal of this scene is to dramatically up the tension by introducing problems that the protagonist didn't or couldn't account for. These grow to become the final hurdle that stands between them and whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish. What you want in your story is for this problem, which is your climax, to feel believable, well established, and threatening. To do this, it's helpful to keep in mind your chain of cause and effect. You can kind of think of this scene or sequence as a smaller and tighter version of the same complications and twists that you've been writing all book long, just with a much faster turnaround time. So, accelerating the chain by reducing the amount of time between the decisions your characters make and the outcome of those decisions helps to build and maintain momentum while creating a growing sense of anticipation for the climax. One way to do this is by introducing unexpected obstacles. You want any issues that arise to feel realistic to the scenario. And a good way to do this is by taking advantage of any gaps that may have come up during the plan. So maybe they're relying on chance in some places, maybe they're working off of an assumption or a bad piece of information. Whatever it is, introducing challenges that stem from a known point of uncertainty will keep things flowing and feel engaging and believable for the readers. And then on the flip side of this, now is also a good time to start firing off your Chekhov's guns. If you're not familiar with the term, Chekhov's gun is a storytelling principle that says if a gun appears in Act One, it should be fired by Act Three. And in this particular case, it means that any details that you have set up earlier in the story that you plan to eventually have payoff should be paying off right about now. So all of these things are much easier to do if you have some kind of idea going in as to what the complications are going to be rather than kind of winging it as you go, which is where our guiding questions come in. We're still going pretty strong with the external conflict. So all of these questions are about thinking through the sticks and stones that you're throwing at the protagonist and the effects that they have. So first, what happens to disrupt the protagonist's plan? What are your sticks and stones? What are they prepared for, and what are they maybe not prepared for? From there, we ask what impact this disruption has specifically in the short term. We want to know the immediate outcome of these problems in terms of both how the protagonist is reacting and what the results of those reactions are. And finally, how is the protagonist at a disadvantage going into their final confrontation? All of these problems will and should take a toll that puts the protagonist on the back foot. You don't want them feeling super confident going into what is going to be this big confrontation. At the very least, they should feel a little bit nervous. With Back to the Future, Marty and Doc's plan is one that kind of hinges on everything going perfectly. They know exactly where and when everything needs to happen. So anything that gets in the way of that is something that puts the plan at risk. Which is kind of what makes this climax so edge of your seat because there are any number of things that can go wrong. And the movie has been about all of these different things going wrong and not going according to plan. Viewers, or in your case, readers, don't know how things are going to get in the way, just that they will. So, right away, they do. The plan is disrupted first by Doc ripping up Marty's letter, then by everything that I talked about with the cables coming undone and so on. The short-term impact of this is that the characters are stressed out. There's not really a lot else that happens in regards to this, just that they're worried that it's not going to work out, which is stakes enough in and of itself. And inevitably, Marty does end up getting home, but because the trip took a toll on the time machine, he is at a disadvantage because he's so far away from where the shooting takes place that he now has to catch up on foot. And there's not really he doesn't really know if he's going to be able to get there on time because the letter was ripped up. So we move from here into locking in the character arc, which is where we take a step back into the internal conflict, which is importantly not yet resolved. The protagonist still needs to prove that they have learned whatever lesson it is that the story's been trying to teach them, and the best way to prove it is by examining how they act under pressure. The essential scene takes place right after the final challenge has presented itself and serves to peak out the climax. This is the critical moment for the protagonist because in the midst of a whole bunch of uncontrollable factors, this is the point where agency is demanded of them. This is because one of the goals of this scene is to challenge the protagonist personally. Whatever it is that they're facing should feel big enough to them that they're struck with some kind of block, whether that is self-doubt or uncertainty or lack of commitment that makes them and readers doubt for a moment if they'll end up succeeding. And how they react to the challenge is what finishes off their character arc. They can choose to overcome, accept, subvert their flaw, even fall victim to it, but the decision has a clear and unique impact on the outcome of the story. Um, there we go. So, as you might assume, the goal is to direct attention back to the internal conflict and allow the protagonist to complete their personal arc. To make this moment more compelling, I recommend creating a challenge specifically around the character's tragic flaw, which is the negative character trait that defines them in some way, like a weakness, a drawback of some sort. The idea behind this is that the challenge isn't something that they could just overcome any other day of the week. It involves them having to go through their character arc up until this point and be faced with something that so far they have not been able to change about themselves. They have not been able to overcome. This makes the challenge feel genuinely threatening, and it gives you a moment to kind of make the character stop for a second. And because this shift happens in what has otherwise been a pretty high octane Act 3, it's a good way to slow down the pacing and allow for some self-reflection. You don't really want to have like interrupt the flow too much, but you can enter like a sort of bullet time where everything is like happening in slow motion around them. They're really sitting with their feelings, they're thinking things through, and responding accordingly. And in my own opinion, this is definitely not a must-have, but I think in general the best responses are ones that take advantage of the character's skills because much like the challenge itself is more compelling when it's connected to the flaw, the solution is more gratifying when it's connected to a strength or a positive trait of theirs. Like a talent or a perspective that's pretty unique to them that allows them to think and act unexpectedly and succeed as a result. So going into the questions you want to answer in this scene, because we're focused on the internal conflict, the answers should focus less on what's literally happening and more on what the protagonist is going through. The important thing here is to illustrate their growth and its effect on the story. So firstly, what is the final challenge the protagonist faces? We answered something very similar in the plan essential scene by identifying what the conflict was that they were preparing for. But again, we're pretty focused on like the protagonist's inner journey at this point. So we instead want to think about what the specific personal challenge that the protagonist is up against. Then we consider what is needed for them to overcome it. This is where we spotlight the tragic flaw. What do they need to understand, accept, or change about themselves in order to overcome this challenge? From here, it is a matter of acting on that new understanding slash acceptance slash change on how, like, to go into how they use their new perspective to win. And finally, what is the outcome and cost of that success? What does victory look like, and what is the price? Back to the Future does something a little bit tricky in that the locking the character arc moment technically happens before the climax really takes place, but a little bit of out of order shenanigans is a little bit expected in a movie about time travel, so we're just gonna ignore it. It's okay. It's also okay if you do this a little bit. But the idea here is that Marty making it back to the future doesn't rely so much on his character arc. So the big challenge he faces right now is saving Doc. He's not going to be able to do that unless he realizes that he needs to take specific and purposeful action if he wants things to go his way. This has been Marty's problem all along. At the start of the movie, he's called a slacker. He just kind of hopes that the future will turn out for him instead of really doing anything intentional to guide it how he wants it to go. And at the start, the stakes are a little bit lesser. He's mostly just faced with the idea of becoming a loser like his old man. But now he's like Doc's life is on the line. That's the thing that he's worried about, and he needs to act if he wants his friend to survive. So Marty has now learned that the occasional risk is worth it if the rewards are good enough. And in this case, he chooses to ignore Doc's instructions not to mess with the time stream because he believes his friend is more important. He puts this new perspective into action when he writes his letter, and when Doc rips it up, he takes it a step further and resets the time machine to give him another chance to warn Doc. And in the end, excuse me, The like resetting the time machine wasn't exactly necessary because Doc ended up taping the letter back together, meaning that Marty's original commitment to his lesson actually ended up being enough. But in a way, this is proof that Doc also learned a very similar lesson, that the people he cares about are worth the potential problems that defying science may cause. We don't see a cost just yet. That's something that gets explored in the later movies a little bit. But it's good to know just for now that that the change in perspective is there and will continue to have an impact. And finally, we make it to the last of our essential scenes, the closing scenes, which are, to no one's surprise, the exact opposite of the opening scenes from Act One. Rather than introducing your characters, the status quo, and plot threads, these scenes are all about bringing all of these elements to a satisfying resolution. So these scenes have a few key purposes. The first is to bring the tension and pacing back down because we've been amping it up for so long. And with the climax under our belts, it's a nice time to settle down and get the story to like an even resting point. Um, these scenes set out to establish the new status quo. These are different for the protagonist. Things are different for the protagonist in the world. And there's frequently a feeling in books about now what, especially if the protagonist has been kind of focused exclusively on achieving their goal. So the closing scenes give readers a glimpse into what comes next for the characters and what problems might still need to be solved. And then finally, and most importantly, the closing scenes end the story. There's not really a lot to say here, just that resolution is what we're aiming for because we want the book to be done when we close it. So the primary goal of the scene is to leave readers with a clear stopping point that signals that the story is over. Part of this is achieved with less intention and less stakes, but there's a bit more involved when it comes to tying up remaining loose ends. So when it comes to establishing the new status quo, a good place to start is exploring the world post-climax and establishing the characters' new goals. This puts an end cap on both the external and internal plots with some details about what has concretely changed about the world, as well as how the protagonist feels about those changes. Setting your sights to the future here is also helpful. If there's any kind of rebuilding or reconnecting that needs to be done, it's a good idea to mention it here because it's a good way of showing that the characters have fully moved on from the problem they were dealing with and are now focused on this new future that they're working toward. And then from there, you can take the time to address any remaining questions. So if there are any pressing plot lines that weren't wrapped up, go ahead and give yourself a little bit of space to tie them up. Importantly, like focus on the pressing plot lines because you don't necessarily need to answer every single question readers might have, because that quickly turns and into an ending overstaying its welcome. So really just try to focus on things that have been directly impactful to the plot and feel free to leave the rest just up to reader interpretation. Our guiding questions are all pretty one-to-one translations of the purposes and goals from the previous slides. So what is the status quo after the climax, which is where you set up all the stuff about how the world and protagonist have changed. And then to really drive this home, you can zoom in on what is the most notable difference from the start of the story. So rather than kind of summing up the new status quo in a vague kind of sweeping shot, you can focus on one or two big differences that kind of encompass the rest. Similarly, it's good to consider what the protagonist's biggest takeaway is, basically what the lesson they learned is and how they feel about having learned it, and finally, how other aspects of their life have changed. This question is a good way to address anything else you want to clear up or any other details you want to include that don't necessarily fit under the umbrella of the other questions. So back to the Future once more. The new status quo here is that Marty is back in 1985, only the very next morning after he left. As far as he's aware, everything is the same as it was, except Doc is still alive. This is not true, however. He's a little bit mistaken because it turns out that the most notable difference is that his life is so much better. Due to his actions in the past, George is successful and happy. Lorraine no longer feels trapped in her marriage, and their individual happiness has had a ripple effect that means the entire family is happier. Marty's biggest takeaway is the same lesson that he learned before, only he now sees the more long-term benefits instead of just the short-term return. He had been so focused on his and Doc's survival that he hadn't previously given a lot of thought to how his life might change for the better with the changes he was making in the past. And this all pretty much covers things from Marty's perspective, but there are also a few nods to how smaller details from earlier panned out. George becomes a science fiction author, and his book is about an encounter that he had with Marty in the past. Lorraine is rewarded for her outgoing friendliness, and she no longer disapproves of Marty's girlfriend. And then I didn't include a picture here, but Doc has a more lackadaisical approach to changing the time stream, which results in the actual ending where he drives in and tells Marty he needs to help him save the future, and they fly away in the tricked out DeLorean. It's an 80s movie, it's great. So, bringing everything to a conclusion at the end here. To summarize, essential scenes are crucial to the structure of Act 3. Here's that graphic one more time just to help you visualize. And just so everyone is aware, these slides will be available for download off of my website. I realize that I've kind of moved quickly and covered a lot of information, so if you want to reference this more later, they will be available. Um, the plan establishes the stakes and sets reader expectations heading into the climax. Contact with the enemy kicks off the climax and ramps up tension as your protagonist moves toward their final challenge. Locking in the character arc confronts that challenge, giving your protagonist a chance to overcome their flaws and save the day. And the closing scenes provide resolution to the story and bring everything to an end. Thank you all so much for taking some time to listen to all of this and talk about writing with me. We'll be doing a Q&A here, but if you'd like to get in touch more to talk about any of these things that we've discussed today in more detail, you can email me, contact me at any of these social media pages. Also, the QR code in the corner here links to my website where I have slides from my previous presentations and a few other resources as well. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Lee. That was wonderful. I feel you add a lot of clarity in terms of how stories in this structure work in terms of the endings in particular. And I like reflecting on so many of the books that I've read, like you can just see how, oh, this is like that idea being applied. So many books that I've read and that are more like genre books, they have this point where it's like the characters go and made the plan. And all it says is they go make a plan.
Yeah.
Like that's
There's
literally what happens. And it's also like I really want to find out how the plan works out.
Yeah. And there's a lot that kind of gets skated over because I feel like a lot of craft books kind of go in with like an assumed knowledge of what that means. And there's going to be a lot of books where like making the plan isn't as like nicely put together as like the characters, standing around a table and being like, okay, I'll be in this place at this time. Sometimes it's just kind of realizing, like in a romance, for example,
Mhm.
um, like planning for the grand gesture and realizing, like, oh, this is what my love interest always wanted from me. So here is a way that, like, I'm going to put together a way I can show them that I've changed and that I'm committed to this
Yeah.
relationship. And I know that in general, like when I talk about the three act structure, I teach to a very specific kind of like the three act formula, just because it can be adapted so well to so many different stories. But there's the nice thing about kind of paring these scenes down to like what specifically they're meant to accomplish is that you can kind of to make little tweaks that don't necessarily follow the template one to one, but you still know the rules going in so you can kind of guide your way through it.
Yeah, I think that flexibility is part of why it's useful. I recently read the book Pick a Color by Suvankam Tamavangsa, which is like a very short novella and like clearly a literary book and not at all really like plot focused, but like at the end, there's that contact with the enemy and you get to see like the strength of the character, um, allowing them to succeed, which is exactly like what you talked about. So like even in these very like books that don't necessarily follow the structure, you can see like bits and pieces of the tools being applied. On that vein, we have a topic from Cheryl, a question from Cheryl Fish, who says literary fiction is much less formulaic than genre. Essential scenes may be very different. How does the structure you are discussing give room for flexibility and spontaneity in your story?
That is a good question because that's definitely true. I think kind of in relation to what I was saying before, like part of the advantage of using a pretty basic pared down formula is that it's not so much about like essential scenes that fill out exactly what like for example with the plan, it's not always going to be like the sitting around the table sequence. That's not like necessarily what it's going to look like. In literary fiction, that might be something more about like the character just sitting down and reflecting on what they've been through so far. um but the idea behind these essential scenes is more about following storytelling patterns and the things that make like readers and listeners and audiences in general invested in a story. We want to see the characters be challenged in some capacity. We want to see them kind of reckon with themselves and what they've gone through, whether that looks like a big, grand, epic adventure like you'd see in science fiction or fantasy, or a character study that you're more likely to see in something like literary fiction.
Mhm. Do you think this relates at all to the differentiation between an internal plot arc and the external plot arc?
Yes, I think in that case, sometimes what happens is that I like they just get switched a little bit. If the
Yeah.
main thing driving the story forward is the internal arc, the essential scenes should themselves be a lot more focused on the internal arc. So the midpoint is like a personal challenge that the character is experiencing within themselves, like a decision they're conflicted about, as opposed to some external force pushing on them. And in that case, you kind of treat the external plot more as a subplot where you just have a few
Mhm.
touch points that help emphasize what is going on in the internal arc.
Mhm. Just in case anybody doesn't know like those terms, can you explain them very briefly, the internal arc versus external?
Yeah, so the external arc is pretty much like anything that is happening to the character based on forces outside of themselves. So if they're struggling at work, maybe their boss is being like the external conflict. They're not getting the promotion they want specifically because their boss is looking down on them. Whereas an internal arc would be more about like them not feeling worthy of aiming for that promotion. Maybe they're not pursuing their dream career because they don't think they're capable or something. Internal arcs are very much driven by the protagonist's feelings in general, like about
Hmm.
themselves and about the world, as opposed to like things that are physically true about the world.
Yeah, that's helpful. So we have a question, a totally different topic from Julie. How would you advise someone who is writing a trilogy to make sure the first book ends satisfactorily when the story is clearly not over?
Yeah, that is a very good question. I think that a good way of going about this is just thinking about, instead of bringing the story to a close, bringing it to a satisfactory resting point. Um, like cliffhangers aren't necessarily bad. There's nothing wrong with them, but they definitely do leave readers a lot more keyed up. And a way to make your ending satisfying is just to feel like we're at a point where we can just take a breath. We can rest and be ready for what's coming next, rather than feeling as though the story is entirely over, or being worried about like what's going to happen in like next in a scene that was cut off right in the middle. Um, Generally, it's kind of good. This is a much bigger answer than what I imagine you're probably looking for, so I'll try to pare it down. But basically, like taking the larger arc that spans the trilogy and kind of chopping it into pieces, like treating it as three smaller separate arcs, and writing to those endings is a really good way of going about that. I hope that makes sense. But please feel free to email me because I do have a lot more thoughts about
Yeah.
sequels that I won't get into here.
Yeah, I do know you have a lot of ideas about that.
A
But
lot of ideas about everything, really.
yeah, of course. We have a question from Kelly Griffiths. How do you feel about a twist or reveal in an epilogue?
Um, I think it really depends on what it is that you're trying to achieve with that twist. Um, if it's something that is kind of prompting the readers to look back at the stuff that's happened previously in the story through like a new perspective of some kind, like I'm all for them. I think that's really good. I think especially if you're going into a series, having some kind of thing that like a little bit of a hook for the next book is a good way of of making sure your audience kind of follows you as you write the next story, I would discourage you from doing anything like specifically for shock value. I kind of like kind of specifically think of the moment like for a silly example from the Thriller music video where he turns around and he's got like the werewolf eyes. That it didn't do anything for the story. It was just like a fun moment, and that's okay. But in general, when you're writing like a novel length piece, you do want to make sure that you're using your word economy efficiently and that anything you're including is going to further the story as opposed to just kind of like make the audience excited for a moment, if that makes sense.
think that does make sense. We have a question from Wendy. In writing creative nonfiction about a dark family mystery or secret, I'm concerned the reader will become invested in a happy ending where a missing person is found. That doesn't happen. Should my ending instead focus more on the strength of the character, the strength of character developed by his wife as she searches for years while raising their children?
Yeah. First of all, that sounds very interesting.
Yeah.
And secondly, like, yeah, I think you're very much on the right track here. Like, if you're not going for a happy ending, I think that's kind of like why I had named the book and the presentation as I did, is you're going for a satisfying ending. And sometimes bad or sad endings, things that don't happen the way readers want them to, can still be satisfying if we understand why they ended that way. And if we can kind of follow all of the logic that goes into the ending turning out in that realm. Um, so if there's been like an emphasis placed on the wife's character development throughout, that is still a satisfying conclusion, even if it's not a happy one.
Um, that makes a lot of sense to me. So maybe like the goals, even if they're not achieved, like the external goals aren't achieved, the like the internal character goals would be where the resolution and the satisfaction comes from.
Yeah, and I would go a little bit further to say even like the external goals are still achieved in some capacity, just maybe not the way readers want or expect them to be.
Okay.
I think like the bittersweet ending that's very characteristic of like Pixar movies is a good example of this, where in a lot of times the ending is going to be like a little bit sad. There's going to be, a bittersweet element to it where you know, it's not always going to be like this happy, perfect resolution that solves all of the characters' problems. There's probably an element to it that they don't want, but
Mhm.
through the journey that they've gone through, both the external and their internal journey, they are at peace with that ending. They have learned to accept that not everything works out exactly the way they want it to and can be happy with what they end up with instead.
We have a similar question from John. What if the main character is killed in the final scene? Is this sort of a similar answer?
Very much so, yeah. I will say it's not something you see happen a lot, uh, especially if you're working in a standalone, but it is something that, if you've been leading toward this death in some capacity, if the death feels earned, if it feels
Hmm.
something that is like not characteristic of the main character, but like characteristic of their arc that they've gone through, that maybe they've been, for example, they've been fighting for survival, they've been very like self-focused the entire time, and they die in a self-sacrificial way to like
Yeah.
help people that they pretended they didn't care about at the beginning of the story or something. There are like it's a very similar vibe. As long as the ending is satisfying, it doesn't have to be happy.
Yeah, we were recently talking about Hamlet, the play, and that's a play where pretty much everybody dies in the
Yes.
in the end. So, and I don't know if that has a three-act structure, but I suspect there's a lot of overlap in that play with what you're talking about.
Yeah. I what's actually a lot more common, especially in Shakespeare, is the five act structure, which
Hmm.
is extremely similar. They hit a lot of the same beats. They just divide them slightly differently, where the big moment happens at the midpoint as opposed to the climax, and the climax is more just a resolution to what has occurred after the midpoint. But in general, you still see the same, like there's the opening and the setup, and here are the key moments where the character we're checking in with where they're at in their
Hmm.
arc. Here's the big external kind of something's coming in and making a challenge for them. It's just
Yeah.
the peaks and troughs are in different places.
Yeah. And that's a good reminder that there's many different ways to structure a story. You don't have to use this
Yeah,
particular
definitely not.
structure, but the tools may still be applied in other structures. We have a question from, I believe, Carol. What is your definition of a pinch point?
Um, for me, let me think of the wording. It's a little bit harder to be like off book when I don't have my notes available. A pinch point to me is a hmm, a good way of thinking about it is like a spot where like a conflict or an event occurs of some kind that is going to have uh like reaching repercussions a little bit. There are going to be continuing consequences on in the story. Um they're generally I mentioned the chain of cause and effect in this presentation. And that's basically just like every action has a consequence, and the pinch point is where that initial action happens that sets off that chain. There are some things that are going to stretch all the way back into your opening scenes, but for the most part, like when big events happen in your story and they like spiral off into the whole entire plot, the pinch point is where those start.
I was thinking about it in terms of my own personal life and my own failures, where it's like the point where I realize, oh, this is how I screwed up, and this is how I can fix it, and then the people in my life will be happy with me again.
Yeah, it all traces
Is
back
that
to
like
right
what you
here.
mean by
Yeah.
the pinch point? Like that point where you realize, oh, here's what I have to do.
Yeah. The pinch point is less the realization and more like the thing you track that realization back to. Like, oh, all of this stems from this
Okay.
event, this moment, this choice.
Okay. Like the one thing that pushes you to get to that point of realization.
Mhm.
So the point of realization can happen a little bit after that, like point of pressure that causes like the reflection.
Yeah. That's more
Okay.
like thinking about like the Dark Night of the Soul is when the
Yeah.
character looks back and is like, "Oh no, at the midpoint I really should have done this thing instead." And that's what's led to all of this kind of moment.
Okay. We have a question from Catherine. Can you please give some examples of slowing down the pace for self-reflection
Yeah.
while locking in the character arc? It feels tricky to slow down momentum during the climax.
It definitely does, and it's a very tricky balance, and I don't like this answer, but a lot of the time it really just comes down to practice. And figuring out like it's all about like really the way you're structuring sentences and the things that you're focusing on. Um, because it's what you're aiming for is not necessarily slowing down the pacing of the story as a whole. You're focusing on slowing down the pacing of that paragraph, that sentence, that chapter, however it is. And you can do this through like a combination of like the word choice you're going for. If you think like verbs like reflect is automatically going to make readers like think of something of like taking a step back, looking at something, like focusing on a single detail instead of everything else that's going on. Um, in like in movie terms, you can kind of think of it as like zooming in on something or things going into slow motion. Largely, word choice is going to be a big part of that. But also like the details you're choosing to focus on being internally focused or like relatively minor in the grand scheme of whatever the rest of the scene contains. There's a little bit more freedom in writing to like spend time on details like and specific moments while the reader assumes that like the world is kind of just on pause around the character for the time being. Um,
Mhm.
so like in some ways the pacing automatically slows down when you do that self-reflection, but you can help it along again with like word choices and just focusing on those details.
I know as a reader, if there is not enough slowing down put in towards the end of the story, I get fatigued, and then like all
Mhm.
these exciting things are happening, and I'm like, I don't want to find out.
Yeah.
Like I need to take a break, like as the person experiencing the story, just so I can catch my own breath.
Yeah. And I feel like that's very important because there's it is good to have one of those stories that readers look back and are like, "Oh, I was so engaged that I absolutely couldn't put this down." But there's the flip side of that, which is like you also don't want to stress your readers out too much. You
Yeah.
don't want to make them feel like they have to keep reading or they're gonna miss something important about the story. Yeah, exactly. I'm so sorry about the pronunciation. Kaya? Kaya? It is about giving the reader a break. It's letting them just take a breath and sit with the character and understand what it is that they're going through.
Yeah, I think that idea of understanding what the character is going through is actually really important. You don't want to just have the action and the exciting. You want to know why it means something.
Yeah, exactly. It's very easy to get caught up, like especially if your external plot is really interesting to just focus on like the details of what's going around surrounding them. But what that sacrifices is sometimes your character gets like caught up in the wash of it, and you kind of lose the elements that make your protagonist like the character that readers want to follow. If they're only
Mhm.
ever observing everything that's happening around them and never really thinking about it, why are we following them instead of like this character over here who might be having more interesting opinions about it?
Yeah. We have a question on a totally different topic from, I'm sorry if I say your name wrong, Marja Karelia. How do you feel about the work of authors such as Paul Auster, who rarely, if ever, ties up all the loose ends, but leaves the reader guessing? I love his books.
I think that there's some room for that happens in like in different genres. I would say that like in thrillers, there's a lot more like ambiguity left behind. In horror, there's frequently a lot more ambiguity. Um, Whereas like it's all about like reader expectations really, because something like romance, like readers want to know how things are going to end. They don't want loose ends. They want like that the nice, fun, satisfying conclusion to everything. I think the other part of it is that when you have a lot of established experience and you are kind of a master in your craft, you're allowed to break the rules a little bit more, because there's kind of an implication that you understand why the rules are there and what you're achieving by breaking them. And I think that's kind of applicable to like every piece of writing advice is that like none of this is a must have. Any rule can be broken at any point and to like various different creative effects and different reader interpretations. But it is important to understand why these are the guidelines that we follow so that you can understand what you're accomplishing by breaking them. So if the ambiguity is something that like lends itself really well to the ending of the story, that's amazing as long as that's like an intentional thing that he's doing with it.
We're just about out of time, but we have a question from Real B. How would you adjust this framework for a short story?
Um, it's basically just a lot shorter is kind of the the real thing to it is. There don't necessarily need to be as many essential scenes. In a short story, it's a lot easier to focus kind of in that blend between like the act two and act three of the short story, to focus on in those terms what's like referred to as the crisis and the climax, specifically about like the choice that the character is faced with, the decision they make, and how that decision turns out. And that can be pared down to any like that's something that can go all the way through a novella, that can be a short story, that can be flash fiction. um it just like the turnaround depends on what your word count looks like, but the same fundamental elements are there, which is you want the challenge, you want their response to the challenge, and you want the outcome to the challenge. And if that's short, that's fine.
Mhm. I think that part of why short stories are such good training for writers is that you can really like hone in on what matters in the story.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
also amazing for word economy. Like if writing flash fiction and short stories is by far the best way to like learn what it is that you're accomplishing with the word choices you're making. So and it can be stretched out where you're getting more out of the words you're putting in even at like much higher word count limits. It
Hmm.
kind of like forces you to be a little bit intentional about the way that you're writing, and what you're accomplishing by doing it that way.
Yeah. We are out of time, but I really want to thank you again for all of the work you've done for this talk and for writing the book that we're releasing very soon on the same subject. I think if anyone had questions that weren't answered, they might be answered in the book as well. But if they have questions for you, I think they can just look up your name and your website will show up. I will also be sending a link to Lee's website along with the recording, and you'll be getting a copy of the slides as well.
Yes.
And if you ever have any thoughts, questions, feedback, etc., for me or for Authors Publish, I'd love to hear from you. You can email support@authorspublish.com. I, I would love to, I'd like to thank everybody behind the scenes at Authors Publish and our team who make these talks possible, and everybody who supports Authors Publish. Thank you so much. Thank you, Emily Harstone, our editor, Caitlin Jans, S. Calicar, Ella Perry, everybody. I'm sure I'm not including many people. So thank you. And thank you, Lee, again. Is there anything else you'd like to leave our audience with today?
Um, Go forth and write good endings. I believe in you. I know that it's daunting, but I genuinely believe you're capable of it, and it's a lot less scary once you actually get into the process.
All right. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you so much.